Palazzo. Having a conversation for a long time. A long, long time, since the mid-80s, when I was small and young and thinner.
A child.
A thinner postgraduate student and was pushed by some friends to ask her for an interview for a small journal that we did, and she terrifyingly said yes, and we had to interview her, and it turned out very well.
I've been terrifying him ever since,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
if you find me a little scary, it's not for you. It's for him, okay?
Great. Subsequently, we've done a lot of things together, published that interview in a couple of places, worked on different research projects and groups, and Gayatri is now a fixture in the annual calendar at Goldsmiths, and Goldsmiths wouldn't really work without her. She's kind of half the brain of Goldsmiths. So she is much published, and I could bore you with my wonderful recall of all of the names of all of the texts, which I could do, but I wouldn't embarrass her too much. But I'm sure you own many of them yourselves. My favourites are, well, we can go through this. Okay. The next one is always my favourite one. It's the one I look forward to. Right? And the next one is what we will talk about a little bit at the end, I hope. Although it's actually in the middle of it. I'm going to ask you about something, and this is how we start. It's a book that didn't happen. Well, I wonder. I don't know whether it's going to happen, whether it's still in a drawer somewhere to be imposed upon the world, or not. But in this title, all I know really about it is the title, there perhaps is the beginning of our opening question. My opening question to Gayatri is about weaving. The metaphor of weft and weave. Okay, weft and weave is a metaphor that Gayatri's used variously across her work for many, many years. I think it's a place to start because we haven't really planned our conversation, and I'm hoping that it will be a bit of a weft and weave, a back and forth, a shuttle, that we'll be able to suture something with thread together to make it work, that it will be a series of moving forward and colourful threads and so on and so forth, but also interruptions, and maybe some broken threads and some loose threads and things we have to tie together and things that just won't work. There's some frayed edges. But the book that never happened, it was announced as a title some years back. I know you're wondering which one, because there were many.
No, I had two guesses, but let's see which one's correct. Go ahead.
Okay, red threads.
Yeah.
And I like this idea because it was going to be about weaving and the reds. What happened to that?
Well, first of all, you got it wrong, as usual, John. It's not red threads, it wasn't. You can hear me in the back, yes? I mean, I'm shooting into the mic. It wasn't red threads, actually. It was red thread. So it wasn't actually about weaving at all. It was another metaphor, like the red thread that ran through, etc.
I hoped it was that.
Yes. Now, the thing is that it was accepted in 2000 by the press, and one person, I was fortunate enough to see after a certain age everybody praises you, it's worth nothing, and then she's over the hill, let's be nice type thing. So I got very good readers' report. Thank you for laughing. I got very good readers' reports, but one of them said, if Professor Spivak does not make her relationship to socialism clear, she is going to get the same kinds of criticisms. In the interim, between 2000 and 2010, I changed, socialism changed, everything kind of went into a hole. And so I'm hoping very much that I will be able to submit the finished manuscript. But you see, I'm going to talk a little bit more about it and text, etc. You interrupt me. By the way, if you don't understand, if I'm not making myself clear, because I got this incredibly irritating note from someone at the Free University saying, Spivak doesn't understand that many people in the audience haven't read anything by her, and therefore she's completely incomprehensible, and so on and so forth. So if you don't understand what I'm saying, I don't expect you to read a word by me, most of you, just stop us, this is an informal thing, and ask me to explain, and I will make myself clear if I can. Anyway, so this book, I hope, is going to see the light of day very soon. But it's now called something else. It's called, and it's got a very heavy title, it's called, and it's an imitation of Benjamin, obviously. It's called An Aesthetic Education in the Era of Globalization. But it's not just an imitation of Benjamin, it's also a sabotaging of Schiller. Aesthetic education, yeah? Because, I'm not a young person. I'm completely irritated when I'm signified as an ethnic. And so therefore, I'm a Europeanist. And what I have been teaching people for the last 45 years is how to sabotage useful things from the people who won for the wrong reasons. So therefore, this is what the book is. Okay, so I hope it will see the light of day very, very quickly. And I will say something to you, John, about text. I made these notes on the plane. See, now I get the idea of text from two ends, yeah? One of them being from the so-called Aboriginals, because the entire story of Aboriginals in India is also rather tied up, although the government accepts it, of course, rather tied up also with the story of Aryanism, the Aryan conquest, etc. So my friend, the historian Romila Thapar, is very careful about not just kind of shooting in the blue and talking about Aboriginals, so always quotes, please. But I used to hang out for a long time with a group of so-called Aboriginals with a heavy Sanskrit name who had been kept in that situation by exceedingly benevolent kind of feudal folks. So it was like ethnicization upon the subcontinent, and I used to walk about and I would sing with them, and they would say, Gan Bona. Gan is a common Bengali word. In fact, I've also been told that the word cognate is highly suspect, but nonetheless it is related to cantare and so on. You remember consonant shift. So Gan, singing, and Bona, weaving. Okay? Now what did they sing? They sang the oral formulaic. And in fact, most middle-class folks, and I quote now my dear friend Partha Chatterjee, find the oral formulaic a bit boring. That is to say, the oral formulaic in the rural areas untransformed. World music is needed to transform the oral formulaic. Now that is one place because they were putting in new ideas. I talked a great deal about it, John, the first time that I talked about those kinds of things, which got me finally an invite from Amnesty International. That thing I did for you, Travel on the Nation in London, quite some years ago, 2000 in fact it might have been.
Yeah.
So that's one area from where I got the idea of text, because of course Bona, texere is to weave, that's where we get textile, so it's not just text, it's the verbal text is a metaphor, right, from textile, that because it's woven. So I got this from one end, and the other end is indeed that textile stuff. So I would say that in a sense, my real question is, how do we interweave? It's not just how is everything woven, what is a weave, etc., but how does one interweave? That one's a hard thing to do. There's a great deal of effort in the world today, especially from the top, to somehow produce something which looks like an interweaving. And we collude. But actually the rules of interweaving are exceedingly complex, and interweaving also happens on its own. You have to know the rules of both kinds of weaving in order to interweave, and in fact our knowledge is asymmetrical. Okay, so that's the textual thing. Everything I wrote on the plane is weaving itself, a text within which we weave our projects. From my point of view, that's the norm. That is to say, as we are sitting here, what is really being woven is the incredible stuff that's happening inside our bodies, right? We are not in touch with that. We are talking slow, in a recognizable and named language. You are understanding, some of you are getting bored, but the real texting is going on very differently. We can't touch it. Inside our bodies, the incredible dance, the motion inside. See, that's the real texting, and it is within that we are held, and that gives us late signals. I'm going to just tell a little story and then move right on. The story is about starlight, okay? Now, when I was hanging out with this group of carefully preserved so-called Aboriginals for 10, 15, 20 years, in fact, I would have to piss in a little kind of squatting toilet kind of thing and carry a hurricane lantern out at night to go do it, right? So it happened one night that the lantern had gone out.
In a hurricane?
There was no hurricane, it had just simply gone out because of the war, actually, because, I'm not sleeping outside now, but because of the war, actually, because oil started costing more and more, so less and less was left inside the lantern, and so, you know, at night you have to keep it lit a little so that you can turn it up if you have to go out. So it just kind of went out. So I went outside and I thought, well, I'm not going to go all the way to there, there's nobody around, I'm just going to pee here. And so the moon had set. And I told my mother later, I really had, in spite of my 12 years in Iowa, I had no real sense of starlight. You know, and as I was kind of squatting there, I could sense the extraordinary presence of starlight. And of course, everyone knows that that's actually coming from a long, long time away, starlight, right? And so that sense of being in the presence, not of history, but of geological time and beyond, planetary time, and kind of kissing by starlight, that really was the sense of being caught, you know, because something was also happening inside my body for me to be pissing quite then, right? So that's the inside thing, the tiny thing, the textual movement inside. And that remote message from millions of years ago, outside in the starlight, that was totally the other end. So I began by saying that I got the lesson of textuality from two ends, the Aboriginal singing trips, Derrida via Latin into textile weaving, and this sense of the inside of our bodies manufacturing some stuff. And now my feet swell because of my kidneys, so in fact, that it also was something perhaps that had already begun, textual, I didn't know. And so the little movement, and then that extremely big one, starlight. So
I want to go slowly because there's two parameters, yes. And well, there are two ways to go here. Obviously, one is to the planetary. The planetary has been a very important thing in your work, and it's important. But also stitching between there and the bodily, the internal. And it may shock some people that I want to ask Gayatri Spivak about menstruation, but I do. Because a very famous essay, which we no longer mention, because it's mentioned by everyone, and so on, and has been rewritten, and you should read the rewritten versions, and so on, was really about something about writing with the body. And I want to ask you about the importance of writing with the body. Not only because I personally have one of these, I know everyone's feeling a bit little uncomfortable about their kidneys and pissing in the starlight and so on. I want to tell you about this condition called demographica. Do you know about this one? It's a condition that I have. Many people have it. About 20% of you probably have it. Where if you scratch yourself, red welts come up. It's called skin writing. There are ways in which skin is also a kind of writing. We want to talk about how I want you to talk about how the importance of, I suppose, it's not just bodily metaphors, but this kind of thinking is for your theoretical work.
It's not a metaphor, no. I mean, no. Let me begin with planetarity, okay? Planetarity, I used that word in Europe, in fact, and don't be shocked. I mean, what's there to be shocked? Everyone says most of the women within a certain kind of age are menstruating, etc. The time for getting shocked is past. Okay, so planetarity. Now, whatever it is, whatever textuality is in the middle of your body, etc., etc., planetarity is by remoteness and indifference. That's what I was talking about. It's not really possible to be planetary. You know, I'm not talking, I mean, indifference is a word, I mean, because you have to say something. I mean, the planetary system is not, say, he or she agrees. Thank you, dear. The planetary system is not indifferent. It's neither indifferent nor different or anything, okay? So it's not about saving the planet by way of our use of resources. The kind of thing I'm speaking of, the planetarity, it's the uselessness of the ethical, the epistemological, the everything. It's planetarity, it has absolutely nothing to do with the preservation of anything. And the sense of this, you cannot have really a sense of this, but it's something that, you see, I'm told constantly now in Northwestern Europe, not in Italy, not in Spain, that I'm not known, and I will be made known by them by translating me. I find this absolutely insulting. But the thing is, what they don't understand is that they don't have the capacity to make anything known. And knowing me or not knowing me is not going to matter in geological time. So that when, for example, Toni Morrison writes at the end of Beloved, her best book, this story is not one to pass on, just weather. She's making a kind of a pointing at this planetary thing, experience of the impossible, planetarity. When Mahasweta Devi writes about the pterodactyl, I don't know if any of you have read that story, some have. She's again, the pterodactyl does not communicate or anything, and it's not real anyway. And so on the other hand, so she's also kind of pointing at the impossibility, that experience of impossibility. This saving of resources is a solid thing, but it's got nothing to do with what the word planetarity kind of marks. That it's not even a word really. But I will say one thing, that this kind of intuition of the sacred from our end, the planet ain't sacred, but from our end it can be an intuition of the sacred, useless and so on. Being good and bad is the same at this kind of, with this kind of perspective. On the other hand, in view of this impossibility, you do what is right or wrong. Those of you who were present at that workshop at Goldsmiths, see, this is what I was not getting said, because I kind of thought that my friends at Goldsmiths kind of knew that this is where I come from, if you can come from such a place. And there was a young man who was teaching me the lesson of everything being different and so on and so forth, and I was very embarrassed. And I said, been there, done that. But actually you can't be there, do that in the planetary. It's just... But having said that, one must still make a very deep distinction between wanting to save the planet, as we say, and sustainability. Sustainability is bad news. I'm not going to talk about it now, but I'm going to keep this answer to these three things then. Planetarity, not a thing. Saving resources, it's not a planetary thing, but not a bad thing. Sustainability, a poor idea. Okay, let's now go to menstruation. Let me...
It's the two ends.
Huh? What?
Is it the two ends or is it...
No. And also, why is that funny, is what I asked. You see, one of the reasons why I can't write my memoirs is that it is still, these kinds of things are still considered for some reason funny. Remember what, given that I was born in 42, and I come from the pre-AIDS generation of feminists. In order for me to write my memoirs, I will have to write about a certain kind of taking on of the commodified heterosexual market of sexual intercourse that would seem like a joke today again. See, so it's not really possible. I can't just write about meeting Derrida. but let's put it, let's just put that on one side. I was wondering why you weren't writing. I say again and again that gender, not gendering, gender is our first instrument of abstracting. Gender is our first instrument of abstracting, I say. And as I carefully wrote down, because I have learned the lesson of this Berlin person, I wrote down I mean something like gender in all languages. I don't mean the crazy thing about there's no word for gender in our language, therefore. I'm talking about, let's say, when Gail Rubin wrote about sex-gender systems, she wasn't just writing about English. So let's say that if we had the ability really not to be just anthropological, but to genuinely enter into the lingual memory of a couple of languages that I don't think cultures can be known, by the way. Languages cannot be known, but one can try to enter the lingual memory. If we did, we would find what I'm talking about, that is the first instrument of abstraction, gender. Now, the thing is that when I'm repeating myself now, repeating something I just said at Goldsmiths, when one calls capital the abstract as such, it can be abstract, but something like gender, the ancient, primordial instrument of abstracting, always comes mixed up with the empirical. You cannot have that first instrument of abstraction completely free of all of the empirical stuff that relates to sexual difference, out of which gender comes. I'm not confusing the two. But anybody knows that to create a sign system, you need a difference. And it is with that difference that the entire system of socius, culture, etc., whatever you call that is devised. You can talk about now. Now, menstruation, in that sense, is something that provides you with a sign system. It's part of a sign system, and I'll talk more about this. I actually found some stuff on my computer and printed it out for you folks. Okay, I'm quoting myself from two catalogue essays, one for Anish Kapoor, which is published in the Guggenheim catalogue, and the other for a wonderful Bengali artist, Chitrohanu Majumdar. I write, there are signs and there may be traces. Traces. A trace hints at something that left this mark. It is not a break between words and picture objects, the verbal and the visual. Although it may seem so, catch the trace. Derrida's whole project, father is a sign, mother is a trace. I think that's not my project, but nonetheless, the project was to catch the trace. And in the last book, animal as a trace, right? Catch the trace is the oldest problem in the book. What then is a trace? Always remembering that it is not an isness. A sign system promises meaning. The reproductive system in the female produces meaning, promises meaning. It ain't a trace. A trace does not promise anything. It is something that seems to suggest that there was something before. It's like elephant shit on the forest floor. It can be either that there were elephants here, or it could be that you were hallucinating, or yet it could be that someone put it there in order to be a decoy for you, or it could be that you were mistaken. Elephant shit does not look like that at all, or, and so on. Indefinite inventory of traces. A trace is not a sign. What organizes human semiosis, reproductive heteronormativity, not heterosexuality, heteronormativity is shorn of the articulatory elements that produce social significance in the art of these two guys. But within it, they have the production of social significance, thus gendering, thus culture itself. So, and so on and so forth. One could go a long way. I'll talk about Marx and Gramsci and Nietzsche, but I won't. Okay, so this is one end. Gender as all of us, first basic instrument of abstraction, which is not at the origin, we are still using it. Okay, and it cannot disconnect itself completely from the empirical. And then I will what I'm doing today is going one end and other end. I will go to experience and tell you how I learned about this. Okay, my grandmother, Rasheshwari Devi, had two sisters, Shaileshwari and Bhuvaneshwari. The youngest one killed herself at 17. It is her story I tell in Can the Subaltern Speak, in order to show that whereas the British Indian reform of sati is much celebrated, when a young single girl attempted to write resistance in her very body, she could not be read. I have tried to understand how she felt as she waited for her periods to begin, so she could disprove what she knew would be the conclusion drawn from her hanged body, illicit pregnancy. My modest reputation rests on two items: the introduction to the Ladhamatology and the commentary on Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri's suicide. I am following that track still. Why did I not mention my relationship to her when I wrote of her? I wanted to see what would happen if she didn't have that certificate of authenticity, which would reflect more on the people's approval of me than on her. And of course, everybody despised it. Now, I want to say how it was she who opened up for me a line from the Mahabharata, which is, as you know, one of the two ancient Indian epics. A description of Queen Draupadi dressed in her single cloth, stained with menstrual blood, dragged into the royal court. But I can say that it is from this single woman, a girl of 17, who engendered my intellectual trajectory, that I got my sense of singularity, and by singularity I mean that which is universalizable. Always universalizable, never universalized. That's how singularity is not the particular, it is not the individual, it's somewhere else. The entire epic of the Mahabharata is about this insult to Queen Draupadi, who had 5 husbands. And in the beginning of the Mahabharata, because it was an oral formulaic epic and each bard had to know the whole story, the entire story is given in the form of a young boy telling it to the blind king. And in that story, again and again, we hear that all of the disaster happened because a woman was brought into the public sphere while she was menstruating, while she was in her feminine nature or Stri Dharma. That's the whole story behind Bhuvaneshwari also. Now, there is one adjective that is used to describe Queen Draupadi as she's in her blood-stained clothes, cloth, single cloth, in the court. Nathavati Anathavat. Nathavati Anathavat. Classical language, so please don't think this is kind of an ethnic thing here, okay? Generally, this is translated as someone with husbands, as if an orphan. Natha actually means Lord. I translate it differently, and I am the object of opprobrium from the traditionalists and the racists and the horrible guys, as well as the resenters of theory, the self-proclaimed activists, as well as the folks who are in the traditional camp faulting me for being too European. But on the other hand, the folks who are in disciplinary Sanskrit fault me for daring to offer new translations of these kinds of ancient texts. But it is Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri who made me understand the entire stuff. Nathavati Anathavat. Lauded and yet as if not lauded. In my reading, each time the woman menstruates, lauding has misfired in the suspension of reproductive heteronormativity. And I believe that's why, again and again and again, in the opening conversation that is the entire story, what is told is she is in her feminine nature, her feminine dharma, in her Stri Dharma suspended. A suicide at age 17 and a disgrace in the family made me understand how the message in the ancient text was transactional. She became my allegory of reading of a powerful woman moment in my past that slowly led me to understand, however theoretical it may seem to you, and Melanie Klein is somewhere in between, that it is through gender where the actual inscription comes really in menstruation and not the sudden coming forth of sperm, that mankind learns how to abstract so that the socius can be established. So that's my menstruation.
I want you to explain more. I mean, in some ways, this leads to the next thing, but in a way, I want to stay with this a little bit longer. The next question that I want to ask has to do with changing minds and patient work. But I think what you've been showing is concern to explain, hints that will go elsewhere, but you interrupt those, because there are many ways we can follow things up. But also somehow showing, enacting a way of weaving these things together. Let's not forget the red threads. Okay? And I still want to ask about socialism. Why socialism, not communism? What the aesthetic education will be and who it belongs to. But these connections, let's stay with Denise, because Denise moves forward in your work and is transformed. And
Niece.
Sorry, Bubenshwari.
Okay, yeah.
Great niece.
I am her great niece, yes. My great aunt.
Which you've mentioned in Postcolonialism, which is a kind of rewriting of that essay. And earlier in an interview you said it was an infelicitous phrase to used in the first essay and rewrote it. But I think it gets rewritten again when you come to the task of understanding with empathy the position of this person, who after all has committed suicide because she is a kind of failed political activist. Or not failed, that's the wrong word. She is not able, in the story, in the original story, if you remember, not able to go through with an assigned task of assassination of a certain figure, was it the Viceroy? Yeah. She does not know that it was the Viceroy. She does not commit this act of some might call it terror, and in order not to be understood as or to be understood as someone who's killed themselves because of a failed love match or something, she waits till she's menstruating and then kills herself then, so people will know, will read it in a certain way. Okay, this brings
the main part is that in the family this is forgotten in two generations. That's why I said cannot speak.
I don't want to get into the cannot speak thing because it's been churned over.
Yeah, but I mean, I just wanted to say it because people thought that I had said that no subaltern can speak anywhere in the world. It was said because inside the family, when she left her letter and waited to menstruate, educated women forgot this and thought that it was an illicit love affair. That's why I was so enraged.
But what I'm interested in now is this story moves forward to your work on sort of a work of trying to find a way to empathise, and this is very difficult, to empathise with the suicide bomber today. Right? And this I've talked about this elsewhere, and it's something that people find quite shocking, quite difficult. And it makes me want to ask you about this phrase that you repeated and for you to unpack it. It's the patient work of wanting to rearrange desires. Changing minds, patient work, this concern of moving people into thinking,
no,
empathetically, or to put yourself in the place of the suicide bomber. And this is difficult.
Yeah. I was going like this because I was listening to unheard music as you were speaking. Because, John, one of the reasons why, I described him as a co-thinker, and he once I wrote a piece on Coetzee's book called Foe, and then I had a discussion, Jane Coetzee, the guy who later got the Nobel Prize, and he told me, Gayatri, you expose and write my worst fears. It was you must have read about Coetzee and what a strange guy he is. This was a compliment, but it was also a very scary compliment. And more my relationship with John becomes like that. He's very sort of resonant with me and kind of says things that makes me like, I don't know you. It's almost as if I'm going to, and my experience of Northwestern Europe, especially sort of young activists, has not been very good. So, and suddenly in response to John's question, I have to say something which is really fairly intimate to the running of my life. And so I have to ask you not to judge me by mishearing my sentences. I have nothing but words in a foreign language. English is not my first language, and I've learnt it well. I love it, but nonetheless, it's not my first language. I have nothing but words spoken in public with which to address this question. So if you want to disagree with me, please attend to the words I'm using, okay? Those who were at Goldsmith just the other day experienced what I experience all the time. When I'm hit over the head, and I often am, my words are turned into the more commonplace words that they immediately resemble. Don't do that to me. Ask the question while we are here and contradict me and say I'm wrong. That's instructive for me. And having said this, let me try to answer John. Yes, empathy is not my word. My word is reading. My word is reading. For me, reading is an extremely difficult task that we have almost forgotten to undertake. For me, reading is the name of almost all doing. And for me, to read, you don't have to have what is recognizable as writing on perishable things. You can read even when it is a so-called oral culture and the writing is taking place in the great genealogical memories on namic substance. I don't know where it is located, but nonetheless, you do not need to have marks recognizable on stone, paper, whatever, in order to read. Reading for me is a bigger word. And if you want to read, then, although it is of course impossible, you have to undertake the task of wanting to get into what wrote whatever it is that you are reading. It's hardly ever a person. It's quite often an entire history, a political text, a physical text, and so on. It's the only task that I think it's worth learning. It's not all the other stuff that there is we mistake prosthetics for our own organs. We think that all kinds of prostheses are our body without organs. That's not the way to go. We should use all of that, but that doesn't mean we abdicate reading. So, and it seems to me that unless you read in this way, knowing that it's almost impossible to do so, you cannot undertake the task of the kind of teaching that is teaching. I gave an interview under duress from this very editor who is waiting 10 years for my book, to the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is a very well-known journal. This woman was so incapable of reading that when I said to her, I am an unbeliever and I do not believe in any kind of religious system, named religious system, but if there is something called sacred, it's this reading-teaching couple which comes close to that feeling for me. She wrote in the interview, Professor Spivak said that for her teaching was a religious experience, which is bullshit of the worst sort. So to an extent, in order to do this, you have not to condone what you're reading. I mean, I can read material that is not a belief thing or a yes and no thing, but I can hang inside, mit Weg sein, right? That's what it is. I can hang in there. And so it is in that way that this woman also made me understand try to understand, I don't understand, but try to understand what would be the position of a young person or a not so young person who would be a suicide bomber, and not simply to say, oh, they're just pathological, horrifying, inhuman terrorists, etc. How is it possible? This is not a question that I alone ask. There are many people who ask questions of this sort. The most recent is Kelly Oliver in her book called Women as Weapons of War. It's a fairly recent book, 2007, and that's how she begins in terms of herself as like the women who were enjoying torturing in Abu Ghraib. So, to an extent, this is the reading impulse. That's where I came in. That's what you were talking about, and that's what I'm trying to answer. It's got nothing to do with endorsing anything. I'm a pacifist, number one. Number two, this uncoercive rearrangement of desire. This is my understanding of what a teacher's task is. When I say, now remember, everything that I talk about is more or less impossible. Because it is really, if anybody has read Marx's third thesis on Feuerbach recently, they will see quite clearly stated the impossibility that I'm talking about. It is almost impossible not to be coercive even when you are most benevolently changing people's minds. It's not coercion, recognizable torture-like coercion, but it's a kind of jollying, sweet, isn't she a charismatic teacher type coercion, okay? So, I mean, the more people say charismatic teacher, the more this unrecognizable coercion comes into play. But you must try not to coerce. How do you try that? By getting to know, read, not in a psychoanalytic way, knowing that it's impossible agentially, the pattern of desires that you're dealing with, so you can shift them, rather than say, I change minds, as many teachers do. Changing minds ain't that easy. So that you can shift them, rearrange them, but it really requires knowing the group that you're dealing with, which is why I'm so fearful of you. I don't know you. I can't do anything with you. So therefore, I'm at your mercy. But that's my feeling about teaching uncoercive rearrangement of desires, basically an impossibility. Consent, Pace Gramsci, is not what I'm talking about. The final thing about it, of course, is that whatever you plan, something will have happened that you cannot anticipate. It is in that hope that you teach, because coercion comes in anyway. You wait for the unexpected down the road, and that is the future anterior, the past future. Something will have happened, and maybe even when you're not around. So that's the whole picture, as it were. Again, my answer is a little bit longer than it should perhaps be, but that's his fault because of the nature of the questions. You asked an easy question, boy, and I will speak for 75 seconds. Please.
Okay, why socialism, not communism?
Why socialism?
I think of your recent text, Other Asians. There was a typo in there that I thought was really interesting. You wanted to say the Communist Party Marxist, and it came out as Community Party Marxist. And I thought, yes, you got it there. But it was unintentional.
Yes, because I'm only a bird in a gilded cage. Joke? Thank you. I'm only a bird.
Can I also remind you of the phrases that one of the things Gauci does, a scrupulous declaration of our interests, so that we can see how this is working. But I wonder if...
I'll tell you. My understanding is that socialism is doable. Communism is fightable for, but not doable. And I believe it is because of what I have learned from Gramsci, and in a roundabout way through being a feminist and knowing that RHN, reproductive heteronormativity, is much, much bigger than political systems. People on both sides are caught in it. Now, socialism, I say, is doable because I feel that it would be doable if what Gramsci, sitting in his jail cell, was thinking about were possible. It's becoming impossible because of digital idealism. I'm not a technophobe, but nonetheless, it's becoming impossible. But Gramsci, when he was writing about a critique of contribution to the critique of political economy, wrote a sentence which is all over the place, where he writes very quietly that Marx's project is not only moral and psychological, not using the word political, but also epistemological. In other words, rearrangement of desires, persistent rearrangement of desires, because every generation needs, this is a persistent thing, so that you can create a situation of citizenship where, in fact, the citizen supposedly is able to use the abstract structure of the state as if it were an instrument for him or her, but imperfectly. That kind of basically welfare state socialism, which is not really a very noble kind of ideal, is something that I, as a minor cultural worker in the world, can move for, given that I work for electoral education in supposedly the world's largest democracy in India. Whereas communism seems to me to be a very much nobler idea, which one can fight for, but which in fact will be contaminated by vanguardisms of various sort if it were thought of as an actually existing thing. Small examples are cited from time to time, but it does seem to me that communism is something we should aspire to, we should think about, we should think about philosophically, but I don't believe that it is something for which we establish blueprints because it is so open. Therefore, it in fact leads to closures. And so I don't have, perhaps I'm wrong, but since this is a political thing and I understand politics only insofar as I can do something, it seems to me that within the context within which I live and die, it is possible for me to work, and indeed has been possible at both ends of the spectrum. Remember, that's where I began, with the lowest of the low and the highest of the high. I can work to establish this kind of trained imagination for epistemological performance that can move toward at least thinking of this, and also political work, more recognizably political work on the ground. Whereas the other one, I don't think I really have ultimately the conviction that would say that such a thing should in fact be brought into, communism for me is something like justice. That is to say, excuse the word, undeconstructible. That wonderful sentence of Derrida's. It is just that there be law, but law is not justice. That's the difference, if you like, between socialism and communism. You can't do justice. I'm glad I thought of that one, because I think it really just came to me, but that's more understandable, isn't it? Okay. Why don't you ask me a question which like that?
Yeah, because it's hard.
Look,
An
hour has passed, man.
We're going to stop so we can talk, I wonder if that you just narrated is the interweave that is the aesthetic education, between those two things. Mm-hmm. What I really like is this lesson, caution, that you not read Marx or Capital as a blueprint for how communism should be. And I want you to say a little bit more about how the project is epistemological, what that means, unpack that.
How do people construct objects of knowledge? That's the status, yeah. That's how you teach people, don't you? That's what you do. How do you construct, let me talk about this Free University thing, area studies. They want a perspective from you. What perspective, man? I've decided that I'm just going to tell some kind of biographical story.
We're on a flying carpet. You can do that. We're on a flying carpet. You can
Yeah,
do that
no.
thing if you want.
Yeah, I will do totally levitation, flying carpet, a little singing.
Actually came to sun. Levitate 3 feet off the ground.
Yeah, we sing.
Yeah, no. Okay.
On Marx's scattered speculation,
Let's open it.
Keep.
I have benefited a lot. So I mean, if you talk about Marx and Spivak, what should always talk about that?
I think also the issue from that essay was really important. Bashka's brought up scattered speculations. A great and important essay. People should read it more than subaltern. But there you talk about how ethics disrupts epistemology.
Oh,
this
yeah.
is very important.
Simply bad faith, okay? But I'm telling you that because I do it all the time, and if I didn't tell you that, then it would seem like I was really being true to my origins and stuff like this. But my dad, who was an extraordinary man, he was an extraordinary man, born in the 19th century. He was a doctor, but he was like people in the past, I mean, quite knowledgeable about many, many things. He would cite quite often 2 Sanskrit tags. Now, Sanskrit tags, some of you have heard me say this, because that's all I have. Sanskrit tags are like Latin tags. Okay, they're tags, but of course, I mean, since I don't think I'm in the presence of Sanskritists, if I didn't tell you, the Harish, what's his name, Trivedi does this, tags, and somehow it becomes like, wow, Sanskrit learning. But anyway, if I didn't tell you, you'd think Sanskrit learning, right? Anyway, and that dad was really like some kind of a learned Sanskritist who spoke to his daughter in Sanskrit, etc. It isn't like that. It's tags, but it's interruption. One of them is Grihitameva kesheshu mrityuna dharmam moksham acharet. You act ethics as if death has you by the hair. Okay? And the second one is Ajaramaravat Vidyanjila. That is to say, you think learning as if you will never die and never grow old. That's the interruption. Understand? Ethics interrupting the epistemological. Now, so, and this interruption it's all over the place. All over the place. But at any rate, I concentrated more on a mere literary learning, training the ethical reflexes so that when the ethical interrupted us or surprised us, the epistemological could be actively interrupted. I do not have that faith or hope anymore. I am now much less hopeful in the current context, and one of the reasons is that I was getting this from this artificially created Aboriginal so-called group who were kept that way, and I thought, idiot that I was looking at this poor, really unfairly treated group actually by themselves preserving an ethical cultural conformity. I was wrong. I was not only wrong, but I was wronged. So that I now feel much more like, I'm a Europeanist, I feel much more like my teacher Aristotle. I feel that all we have the right to do is to train the imagination for epistemological performance, and the ethical will happen properly if perhaps we do this in good faith. What is good faith? Good faith is also worth nothing in terms of the planetary, but nonetheless, there's that my entire division between agent and subject, and Judith Butler makes those kinds of divisions also. I mean, you have to make those kinds of divisions in order to be able to act in a certain way. So today, I'm much more interested, and even then in a hopeless way, because I don't believe that there is any room for the humanities or this kind of teaching, slow teaching, and so on and so forth, in our world, either on the so-called bad side or on the so-called good side. So I don't think it's going to happen. But some of us, for the philosophers of the future, have got to keep on making these noises. But basically, I'm personally an optimistic and resilient kind of person. But in fact, the realization now is in a loss of hope.
In order to find some hope, maybe we have to do what last time we did this, which was now longer ago than I want to admit. I got into serious trouble because we went on for 3 hours with the questions. So we're not going to do that. We're going to open it straight up to people who will ask questions. And this will surprise us, we hope. Or not. Or it may go in directions that we don't want it to go. But that would be good, really good too. Anything is welcome. Yes, was that a scream from the back? Yes.
Yes.
I'm open to that as well. Somebody who wants to ask something of Gayatri.
Any
Maybe comment.
There's a hand. I can see.
I can't see it.
Yeah, come on.
I mean, there is one aspect
I see.
of the work.
Okay, go. Yeah, do what?
Transition from Ram Prasad and the option of breaking into Kamashi.
I should break.
Invocation of Durga
And
and the Bengali mother goddess.
Hmm.
So you rarely talk about it. You rarely ask questions about that.
You know, I missed the first part.
Ram Prasad, translation.
Yeah.
And,
That's not a question, man.
yeah, so again, if you clarify,
I should.
what's invested there?
What's invested in translating Ram Prasad? Very good. Ram Prasad.
You have to say what that is.
Yeah, it's a name actually. Ram Prasad Sen. It's a name. See, I translated some of Ram Prasad Sen's hymns. It's late 18th century. And, yeah, that's right, late 18th century. He was a colonial guy, but so therefore, but he's often in Bengali, my mother tongue, Kali hymns, often mistaken for a tantric, some of you must know what that means, a kind of underminer of high Hinduism through ways of worship which are more bodily, etc., etc. I mean, I don't really, as I say, I'm a Europeanist, I don't know that much. But he's not really a tantric, he's a quote tantric, unquote type thing. And basically what he and some other extraordinary hymn writers of that generation in Bengal were doing were actually uncoupling the image of Kali from the high Hindu pantheon in terms of what is understood as bhakti, which is, as I was saying the other day, bhakti, B-H-A-K-T-I, what is quite often translated within Indian studies on the model of the European Reformation as a personal relationship with God or gods. That's not what bhakti is. Bhakti is rather, if you know the name, if you know the word, it's a self-separation and entry into pre-established psychobiographical strips, etc. It's a much more complicated thing. But at any rate, it certainly is a blow against the distance and corruption of high Hinduism. Now, these folks, but I translate, now I come from a Shakta family. I come from Shakta, Shakti, Shakti in Sanskrit and Shakti in Bengali, power, a female, a name also of a goddess, and generally speaking, the Shaktas are the Kali worshippers, the dark goddess who punishes, childlike, etc. Now, my image of Kali, however, comes percolated through this late 18th century rewriting of Kali because that's the stuff through which we were not a very religious family, but on the other hand, we were certainly a family that sang a lot, so therefore, and we sang these extraordinary hymns a good deal. I was asked to translate these poems. I had no intention of translating them, but I was asked to translate these poems by my wonderful publisher, Naveen Kishore, who was launching an exhibition of tantric diagrams. The tantrics made kind of diagrams, yantras, which was supposedly diagrammatic of the human body and other kinds of ideas, religious ideas. And this exhibition by Nirod Majumdar, a guy who married a French woman and lived in Paris, therefore ethnicizing somewhat his own origins, etc. It didn't begin yesterday. And this was accompanied by French translations by Madame Majumdar, which really were like, sort of Victorian biblical prose English translations that are used generally to translate sacred texts, so-called. So when I was given this, I translated them. And I felt that I had not done a good job because I was connected to these songs in such a very kind of pre-sentient way. That's about all about the translations. But if I can't, do you think I could tell a story, or am I going too long? Maybe too long. Okay, ask another.
Unless somebody is going to jump in with a question, or we want the story.
This story I've told before, but most of my stories I've told before. My second common law husband left me with, the first one was not common law, so my second husband, common law, left me saying, "You are so violent that nobody is ever going to want to be with you anymore." This is ridiculous thing. But of course, I believe, why do you think I asked you to criticize me here rather than elsewhere? Because I've been kind of shattered in this way, like many of us of this age, we wear boxing gloves. So at any rate, I was completely shattered, and shattered in the American sense, not the British sense. And so I kind of, sat and drank a bottle of gin a day, etc. And, I didn't do anything. I was, totally beyond help. I was in trance. And then Nancy Blake said to me, how is that funny? Eh? Nancy Blake told me, Gayatri, you've got to go to a shrink. Now, I'm a Bengali middle-class girl of a certain age, right? So at that point, going to a shrink was not a choice. But Nancy dragged me. She said, I have this wonderful, wonderful Marxist Lacanian psychoanalyst who is really going to be just wonderful. Okay, I went. Monsieur Mazarin. He was just the most wonderful. He would I'm positive transference of the WhatsApp. He would call me venez, venez. And he would always do my name, Gayatri Spivak. He was just anyway, so now he didn't know Bengali. That's my language, right? He didn't even know English. And anyway, it was an analyse du soutien because I had only 2.5 months, so he was not going to do a real one, right? So we sat face to face. But, I told him what it was. But he forgot all that. And he started slowly unpeeling, talking to me about, he very quickly he came into these songs. And, normally I don't really talk about these songs. So he came into these songs, and then he made me sing them. He made me do them in Bengali, do them in literal translation French, then real French translation. And then when he was somewhat wrong, because, this is a hentheism as a thing, henotheism as Max Wheeler would say, it's not monotheism, right? So he kind of misunderstood it to that extent, but I was not lecturing him. But he said right at the end, because my second husband was Irish working class from Ireland, born in County Cork. It wasn't so he said to me, after all of these extraordinary pictures of Kali, the black goddess who punishes, wearing those arms, severed arms around her middle, stepping on her husband with her tongue out, and with the heads, the severed heads in her hand, he's smiling. So after all of this, he says the last day, how could someone brought up on the Blessed Virgin understand this concept of violence, Gayatri Spivak? So that's he saved me. So that's the story that I wanted to tell.
So,
I was curious about this persistent rearrangement of concursive rearrangement of desire. It was really crazy. I mean, in the end, is it a myopic situation when you speak about training teachers, or is it like how do you relate to thinking or to psychoanalysis, or where I mean, is there any particular desire that must be rearranged, or is it just that is that we have to rearrange the desires all the time in order to be creative and open and thinking and innovative? Or
This is an extraordinarily good question, Alexander. One doesn't know. You are suspended in the middle of all kinds of problems. It's not, nobody is there for, because this is not a healing or a curing. There's no cure here, right? So what, you see, that's why I said before that desires have to be not in a psychoanalytic way. They cannot be known, after all. You know, how can you know desires? I mean, this is not possible. So what you're doing in the teaching situation, you are not actually, the word student is a position without identity. For somebody who has taught for 45 years in the university system and for 25 years in the villages, the students are coming and going, coming and going, coming and going. They are certainly totally filled with human reality, but that's not how you are relating to them. It's a like I say, it's a position without identity. It's almost as if so-called quote real unquote desire. So that it's very different from psychoanalysis in many ways. They are under erasure. They're almost crossed out. So you are not actually dealing with that ground of being. You are not in loco parentis as a teacher. This is, you are dealing with other people's children. They are going back into a situation where the more primary semiosis is going to take place. It's a very complex scene, Alexander, I will say, because nothing has been given to you either, like the desire of the analysand, because these are also elementary school children. So they are not there necessarily because they want. And also, you are, of course, I don't, obviously these schools, I don't take money, but they're run by my money, but the thing is that it is a money kind of situation. It is as if they're paying me. The fact that these students are not giving me money doesn't mean anything. Money is involved there. That, of course, is also psychoanalysis. We have heard Lacan talking about the fee and so on and so forth. But this earning a living in the classroom by doing this, and the student as a position without identity are contractually arranged. It's because one does have the sense, I may say, of marriage as a sacrament, which actually, not as a sacrament, but as a contract, because one does know that even reproductive heteronormativity can be contractually arranged, and a contract brings with it certain kinds of obligations that you can even begin to do this. But I'll tell you, once you're in the classroom, all of this disappears. It's like the way in which athletes play. You know, I mean, when they're actually making moves, I mean, you do an instant replay and you see the moves. But if they stop to think about those moves, they're not very good. So I'm talking now in this kind of a way. But you lose your, I mean, you're teachers, you know, you lose this self-consciousness. You play to lose, and you are in the awareness of no awareness. The only thing that you do know is that these are almost human beings, and they are making you do things rather than you to them. And later you think, hey, in a big way though, what I'm really doing is trying to rearrange desires. And so when you talk to their parents and so on, you can, in fact, even talk about rearranging desires. But otherwise, you know, you are suspended in the classroom while you're doing this. It's a fantastically fine question. I don't know what the answer is. In fact, when I'm outside, I think to myself, is this dangerous thing what I really do? So I can't give you a more satisfactory answer than this.
Given that Sweden is often called the kind of best country in the world for gender equality, best country for women to live in the world, I would love to hear perhaps both of you comment on this kind of mobilization of this representation of Sweden. For example, now with the royal wedding going on, there has been a lot of controversy around, whether the symbol of the princess being walked down the aisle by her father rather than walking down together as a couple or with both her parents. So a comment on the kind of mobilization of this representation and what function it serves in relation to other countries and political work that goes on with other states.
Okay.
You begin.
Yes, that's scary that you've asked both of us. I don't know enough about Sweden. Okay, I'm from Australia. So ABBA was the first experience there because they were huge. That's obviously there was 2 and 2, so there's some kind of representation there. But I think that they're getting married. The royal princess and the prince and it's a princess to come.
No, princess with a prince.
Okay. It hasn't really registered on the British media yet. I'm glad that I'll be able to take that news back. Obviously, royalty is a big thing for communists. It's where we see one of the points of struggle. But your question is more serious. Is about the place of Sweden, I suppose, as image of good politics. I think there are ways in which we could talk about that. What constitutes good practice and good politics, and good in terms of Gayatri's work. Good and bad, these kind of evaluations are at stake and to be discussed. As I say, I don't know much about Sweden. I've met a lot of Swedes, and I can talk about those I've met. And I met them, funnily enough, in Calcutta, and I did early work on charity workers, people who came to work for Mother Teresa. And I had big problems with them, those who came wanting to well, I really thought, and it was in conversation I have in particular, a couple of people I know, individuals that are not representative of the nation and all of that, but in terms of my experience, it was charity work. And here, Gayatri's work is kind of resonant for me. It's the way in which she talks about those who, one of the desires that people have that maybe need to be rearranged a bit more vigorously is those who want to do good and help. And that imperialist, colonialist, whatever, that charitable gesture. Because that is where an interest in oneself, not in the other, is in operation. It masquerades as an interest in the other. For the Mother Teresa, I don't want to badmouth the saint, well, yes I do actually. Chris Hitchens, who we don't like anymore much, who called her withered hellbat, peddling the Pope's heinous policy of compelling the faithful to breed. I think you probably got it right. But it was there, this issue of what is a good model, I suppose. And in the way in which these particular people I have in mind spoke about their work among the poor really is a desire that I think needs to be rearranged. Because it's an alibi, an excuse for the front line of expansion of capital, of globalization, of ongoing colonialism, of accumulation. And it's an alibi for all the other ways in which World Bank, IMF and so on are entering the place of the poor.
Okay, I will say this. I begin by saying it's undoubtedly, as a woman more of a certain class, certain colour, more comfortable to live in Sweden than perhaps in many places in the world. Let's just take that as a given so that you don't feel that I don't think so. Okay, having said this, my question is, what is it to be free as a gendered person, male or female? And what is Sweden? I wrote some about this some years ago when I spoke in Sweden, and it's in an essay in a volume called Cosmopolitics, I think, edited by Funk Chia and Bruce Robbins, where I wrote in detail, helped by material that my friend Stefan Jonsson gave to me, responding to my request. I wrote very carefully about this self-concept of Sweden. What is Sweden? How is Sweden when it thinks about today's Sweden? So take a look at that. That's a more careful answer than anything that I could give now. But I also feel that this is partly related to the incredible arrogance of describing one's own society as the best is worth nothing. Look at the so-called European Constitution that was not accepted. Anything that breeds this feeling of superiority when we are all on loan in the world is to be questioned and undone. I'm not a Christian, I do not like humility, but I certainly feel that an interrogative spirit opens and a claiming spirit closes. And see, in the European Constitution, so-called Europe claims the same thing. And then I will go to a speech I gave recently at Berkeley called Situating Feminisms, where, in fact, I must say I was very pleased that one of your diplomats, a queer guy who works in Saudi Arabia, Joachim Bergström, I didn't know him then, but he helped me with my visa because I lost my visa. Right? But he was in the audience, right? And I said that, the conviction of gender workers who quickly go and work to make all of the, the Beijing platform and so on. I'm not against anything. I speak to the CSW. I will work at anything. Remember the first sentence I used. But the idea that our real duty is to redo these bad genderings, we should question this a little bit. I'm not saying keep really poor gendering alive. No, I'm not an impractical person. But I took, for example, one situation which is both poison and medicine. Everything is both poison and medicine. You must learn how to use it so that it can be medicine. And that was what leads to all these things that are called honor killings and so on. Placing your dignity in the man. I said, now, how do you deal with this rather than simply do nothing epistemological but just crush and save and have it come back? I mean, we saw Ruth and Sati, right? In India, I don't even know if there's any Indian woman here of more or less my age, but she would understand what I'm talking about, coming back, although it had been criminalized in 1829. So I said that this is just an example. And after that, Judith Butler and I have had many conversations over the phone about this one. I said the placing of one's dignity in the other is not necessarily male or anything or class superior, is something that one finds also in a situation of friendship or love, whatever you want to call it, in super educated and free people. Now, how do you move this tendency so that it is not caught by a certain kind of class gender bind, so that this something that's become poison, I was talking about the side speaker conversation, so let's not go there, it will take a long, long time, but it has become poison. How do you slowly, in the social homeopathy, learn enough so that you neither condone the poison, but you read, it takes time. You read in such, you cannot save the whole world. You read in such a way that slowly this can become. And in order to do this, you also have to do a great deal of work in the socius around. Undoing European arrogance of superiority and freedom is comparable to the work here, that other work where you have to really involve yourself and take a risk. Remember the funnel that we were reading. Take a risk so that, in fact, these kinds of places where desire is placed can slowly shift. This is a complicated project. So therefore, this is how I would approach such a question, even as I will end where I began. It is undoubtedly more comfortable to live, if you're a certain class, a certain colour, your sexual life in a place like this.
Over here, in the light.
I just wanted some clarification on what is your definition of being a European? Because frankly speaking, you would be the last person on earth that I would consider saying that.
I know more about European texts than I know about other texts. That's what I mean. I read for pleasure Kant, Marx, Hegel, Freud, stuff like that. I read Porphyry, for example. I read Augustine. I like reading Latin and Greek stuff. That's a Europeanist. Europe fascinates me. I mean, I'm allowed to make it my objective. And my feeling is that one doesn't therefore forget its bad politics. And I don't think Europe is my goal, my ideal, my anything. And perhaps because, and it's a little bit like Moby Dick, you want to kill the whale. But on the other hand, you have to know it well, and in order to be able to say, look, if they want to sabotage their stuff, you have to go in good faith. You can't just, then you know nothing, and you want to provincialize it. You have to remain in comfort and safety yourself. I don't think it's worth doing it. I think that's like that Shakespeare thing. I can call the spirits from the vasty deep, and then Shakespeare says, Shakespeare is what comes to me. And, but will they answer you? Will they come when you do some of them, or whatever it is? You see what I mean? So, I don't like being patronized as an ethnic person who's provincializing Europe. I mean, they don't believe it, but I like reading this grand stuff. I like reading other things too. But you can't know everything, eh? That's all. I'm learning Chinese, how I'm for the last 6 years.
Very well. Another. I'm sorry, I can barely see in the middle there.
Hey.
Carl.
Maybe could you relate this, what you just said, to this book you've written on globalization, like the one you're planning to publish, and aesthetic education in the age of globalization?
Well, Schiller wrote that book, you know that. I mean, Schiller wrote that book, the aesthetic letters.
Yeah.
So I've quite provocatively taken that expression. And my teacher, Paul Deman, made a very good critique that Schiller termed Kant's completely self-undoing, autocritical, critical philosophy, where philosophy is, now it's my word, intended mistake. Schiller undid that into a kind of chiasmus, a balance. And so for him, Spieltrieb, imagination, reason, everything goes chaka, 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 nice balance. But that's not enough, because most people kind of go by that. I would make such a mistake too. You want to put something into action, you make a mistake. You may take the double bind, you turn it into merely a contradiction, and you move along. So what I have tried to do there is to show how we need to make these kinds of mistakes, but not Schiller's mistake. So therefore, that's what it is. It's sabotaging this entire idea. I mean, I like the idea of something that is neither reasonable nor unreasonable, which flowered into a very complicated theory when capitalism began in Europe as the theory of the imagination. That's not my theory, but I'm writing in English, I've got to use a word. So I do say that that's not what I'm telling you. Eagleton told me that, you see, those imagination theorists, they failed. I mean, what are you doing? I said, no, you're quite right. They didn't fail, they succeeded only too well in a kind of class apartheid in the former colonies, like, for example, in India. So, therefore, I'm trying to look, again, your question, as a Europeanist, whatever people say, Afrocentrism, Indocentrism, etc., in fact, most systems of education, in spite of saying, Buddhists did the Bihar so many years ago, Nalanda University, bad faith, denial of history. So to an extent, the terrible model that we have inherited, history has given us this, that has to be sabotaged in some way, rather than legitimized by reversal, calling these things this and that centric. So that's what that text is about. And all of the chapters show some kind of a double bind, of different kinds, and how to kind of deal with them, keep them alive. You cannot solve them, they're not chiasmuses. And how finally there is perhaps no hope. The first two sentences of the book I said twice at the Goldsmith College thing without saying that they're the first two sentences of the preface. Actually, it's the first sentence, which is only capital and data. Globalize, everything else is damage control. No, that was mine. And there's a very, very long footnote about digital idealism on page 27 of the printout, but undoubtedly will be some other page in the printed book.
I have another question coming, but I think I want to keep it to the end. So if anyone else,
I think it's the end, no?
well, then this question is coming. I suppose it's anyone. It's related to the Europeanist question, which I think
Hang on
has
a second,
something.
don't forget. Hey, Bhaskar. Oh, got it. That non-alcoholic beer, though.
It's finished. Unfortunately.
Good.
There's
Oh, it's finished. Okay, tonic water, Babu.
Tonic water.
Huh.
We've
Bottle
got
chai.
tonic water here. No, we've got.
No, that's not. That's just.
I'm not
water.
enough of a European, so
Carry on, carry
it's
on.
mine. The Europeanist question: are data and information globalized? Everything else is damage control. You're a Europeanist, but you're learning Chinese. If you could tell us what's at stake.
I don't really know, frankly speaking, I don't know. I mean, I don't have to answer to anyone because, I am growing old. Who's going to tell me anything? I have given no hostages to fortune. Although I lost almost all of my little nest egg because of the general behavior of the capitalists, nonetheless, I think I'm not going to live very much longer. I'll be okay. And if I'm not okay, then I can always go to these village schools and kind of hang out because, they'll keep me. But the thing is, I've worked for them for so long, it'll be okay. So therefore, I don't really know. But if I rationalize if I rationalize an answer, I would say that the Asia Pacific is the biggest phenomenon in our, is that beautiful. This is mine, no? It's not yours.
It's yours.
Okay, good. So I would say that the Asia Pacific is the most extraordinary phenomenon in my time. I don't believe that you can read anything by just visiting, as obviously like most people I'm constantly invited to go to Beijing and Shanghai and so on and so forth. And it's very American model, Tsinghua University, etc., etc. Everybody speaks English perfectly and so on, where people translate me and so on. You can't, to China and India, I think, are rising like rockets and the bottom's falling off. So I would go to the kind of mud schools, not even the ethnic minority schools, because they are kind of showcases. And I'm an Indian citizen, and so in a little while, we would go to places which China is a huge country, even the education officer didn't know quite where these schools were, etc., and what we have to push these things in the mud, etc. Long story. But anyway, the education officer, the last time I went, said, you got to get a letter from your leader next time. So I said, hey, I don't have a leader. Then I don't know. You don't have questionnaires. You're not asking everybody to learn English. You're hanging out. What are you doing? I said, well, this is my work. I'm a literary critic. He said, no, you get a letter from your leader. So I waited a little. But then I've just written to Mr. Wu Han, who was my kind of contact in Kunming. He's moved to Beijing, but I've written him, what can I do? I want to go back to Sichuan and then go into the area near the Laos border. But Mr. Lee told me to get a letter from the leader, and I don't want to go through Beijing and stuff, where Columbia University professors going down, etc. So, I don't know. That's how it became what it became. And, see, never a short answer. And what I'm interested in also is Oceania, right? Because the Asia Pacific jumps over Oceania onto the western coast of, what should I call it, the United States, the Greater Caribbean. Or it, what it does is that it does a so-called non-ideological imperialism in Africa. And there's a new river project which I'm working at, which even you don't know about. I'll show you what that is, which has to do with this. Oh, Chandanagar, yes. Oh, right, of course you know. Kara. But have you seen the latest thing Charlie Armstrong wrote? He sent today?
Not from, no.
Okay, then I'll send it to you. I'll send it to you. Okay, so it came today. So that those kinds of rag things, it's not enough just to be a Europeanist anymore. Okay, as I was telling Abhijit this today, I have made no effort to remain whatever the hell Indian is or remain Bengali. I mean, in fact, I resent because I am an Indian citizen, I'm deeply critical of the Republic of India, and I resent my class, the Bengali middle class. But whatever has lasted in the wash. And so it's an absurdity, but I don't mind. See, so that's why I don't seem to be a Europeanist.
You can have a comeback on that.
Just a couple, because when I first read your, and I heard you speak 12 years back at Berkeley, I see you very universal. Hence, I was a bit baffled as to why just Europeans. But it makes sense.
Good. Universal is not good.
Because Shakespeare,
Data,
Moby
finance,
Dick,
actually.
Huh?
What are
What?
three things?
Yes,
Global-
capital, data, and Gayatri Spivak. No, suppose. Where is Africa in all that I'm talking about? You think universal is minus Africa?
No.
I didn't say a word about Africa.
Or Australia.
So then, or what?
Australia.
Or Australia. Well, Australia a little bit.
Australia.
Australia a little bit. I've hung around.
That's right. But
That's
I want to
very good.
say, an important thing
That's
about
very
this, an important thing about this though is that this education, this Europeanism, is something that comes out of Calcutta, a very important city in Europe, or at least in terms of European colonization, the imperial project. In fact, I've argued elsewhere, and Rico is here somewhere, he reminded me of this, that Calcutta is the first city of empire. It's a co-constituted place. The banks are in London and Manchester and Liverpool and the shipping port, but the extraction of wealth, the accumulation is there, and the education project, and so on and so forth. You've got to think these places together,
But
co-constituted.
in this river project, what is coming out, comparing Senegal and Chandanagar and then Calcutta, is the fact that at the end of the 16th century, since the Ottoman Empire was the model of empire, and the Holy Roman had kind of bitten the dust, but nonetheless, it was kind of limping along. And even so, they didn't know, neither the French nor the English knew how to be imperialists, and the British were even a company. So that the whole situation of what was happening in Calcutta with Hailey Berry College and people writing Bengali books and everybody, it's a little bit different. Victor Kiernan knew this. It's a little bit different from, that's why it's the first city of the empire, and that's why we are as we are. I resent it slightly because it's called, of course, the Bhadralok class. Okay, that's a very solid Bhadralok class. But in Bengali, of course, it's still a word, Bhadralok, gentlemen. And so therefore, when I'm speaking in English, just as the word fellow doesn't have a feminine, in English, I'm supposed to call myself as belonging to the gentleman class, whereas in Bengali, of course, there is a female word for it, Bhadramohila. I'm a Bhadramohila, not a Bhadralok, but not in English. In English, I'm from that Bhadralok class, but the production of the Bhadralok class was a kind of pre-imperial, just as Saint-Louis in Senegal, rather than Dakar and stuff, is a kind of, so that the complexity of diverse imperialisms is seen much better through Calcutta and St. Louis, let's say, rather than Latiensis, Delhi, and Dhaka.
And so the project is to track this stuff, through connections through rivers.
It's much more.
Ah, so question. I think we're going to stop with much more.
Yeah.
Okay, look, I want to thank you guys for your contribution,
Thank
for your
you.
writing, for your conversation here, and for coming to Clandestino 8, Clandestino Institute. Zindabad. You want to do that? Okay. Look here.